Welcome to the Hub. It's a place that we are really all about how do we create the conditions for emergence, for collaboration, for synergies. How do we create the conditions for serendipity? You know, those kind of coincidental meetings that lead to something else. My name is Tatiana. I'm part of the founding team here. And along the way, I have been really inspired by people who are thought leaders in the world around what, you know, I kind of think it's thinking that challenges the status quo. And so for me, that's really the reason that we started the Hub, the reason why we want to enable conversations like this, is how do we take big thinking, the big thinking to change the world, and how do we ground it in ways that we can lead differently in our lives, in our companies, in our organizations, in our families, with new ideas we might put into place. And so when Richard's book, The 5 Literacies of Global Leadership, came out, and when his consequent papers, if you follow his blog, came out, around questioning our paradigm of progress and questioning our paradigm of leadership, I thought, really cool, he's coming through Amsterdam, does he want to drop by the Hub? And he does. And not only that, he did, he's here. Tonight is really about an informal conversation to hear his thinking, where he's at, but also a chance for some of you guys to meet each other and maybe ask some questions. And I guess the test will be at the end about, do you have any new ideas that you can ground in your own practice of leadership, going home and going back to wherever you are? So I'd love you to hold that question in the back of your mind and really test yourself. Be like, hey, is there a new aha here that I can actually ground in my own leadership to try and live into the future a little bit differently? So that's the challenge. That's Richard. And the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, just a few minutes ago, Peter Merrick, my friend, came along here and said, don't take yourself too seriously, Richard. Apparently I was looking a bit glum. That's my happy face. When I was at school in England, going back a bit, one of the teachers there, almost every day, would say to me, take that smirk off your face, Haynes. And I had to learn how to smile again. So please excuse me if I look glum. Inside I'm smiling. I'm very happy to be here. And I don't want to talk for too long. It would be good to open it up to questions and then a conversation. And it's difficult to tell you where I'm actually at today in my thinking. The reason for that is when the 5 Literacies was published, and I'll tell you the circumstances, or we'll backtrack and I'll go back a bit. But when the book was published, which was about 3 years ago, it was really then that it started dawning on me what I discovered. So talk about being a slow learner. It had taken 3 to 5 years to write the book. I'd written the book, I published the book, and then suddenly, wham, I understood what it was that I was working with. The book was an accident. I had absolutely no intention of writing a book on leadership. It was just that I found myself working with some, I was going to say extraordinary men and women, ordinary men and women doing extraordinary things. Thinking extraordinary things, doing extraordinary things. And one of my colleagues, one day, we would regularly debrief after a day's session with the clients we were working with, advising on different aspects of the future and the implications for that on an organisation or a government or whatever. And my friend and colleague, his name is Marvin Oka, you may have heard of him, he's a behavioural modeller, and we were working very closely together at the time. And he said, you know what? Everything we're seeing doesn't make sense. I said, what do you mean? And he said, if you read all the texts on leadership, and then compare what is said in those texts with what we actually see people do, and the choices they make, and the decisions they make, doesn't make sense. And I thought about that, and I looked at a few books at that stage. I'm not a great reader of management or leadership texts, because there's so much bullshit. But I did check up on a few, and I realised he was right. That the behaviour, the thinking, the inner state of being of these people we were working with. Some people you'd readily know, their names are in the newspapers. Others, probably people you'll never hear about. These were men and women, young, old, different ethnicities. You know, people, no common ground really. But clearly it didn't add up. There was something going on that no one was actually writing about. So we did some research, and it was all action research. It wasn't theory, it was action research, to try and find out more deeply what was going on. The first thing I found out, because I'm such a skeptic, was reading the leadership and management textbooks, most of which come from the USA. I'm talking about people like Tom Peters, Gary Hamel, John Cotter, the worst criminal of all, Jim Collins, from good to great to really dreadful, you know his book. I realised that a lot of the propositions, the basic assumptions and the propositions of people like that are deeply flawed. And so what they tell us is also deeply flawed. And the leadership paradigm that is, or myth, that has been perpetuated particularly in Europe and the US and Great Britain is a model that may once have worked. I'm not at all sure, because I'm not a century and a half old. It may once have worked, but it's no longer relevant for the world we're in today. And then I started thinking, in our research we went back to what we call the civilizational worldview. And this is important, because this is the starting point, this is the seed of what then occurred in the 5 literacies. And the 5 literacies isn't a theory, it's not a model, it's not a methodology, it's not anything kind of tangible. It's more an integral praxis, a state of being, an integral praxis, coming from a level of awareness that I think is different. But when looking at the civilizational worldview, of course, you first have to define what we mean by the civilizational worldview. That worldview is and has been common for the past 1,000, 1,500 years in terms of a world system that creates an elite. The elite attempts to create wealth. That wealth is then protected by the elite and by most of the institutions that are put in place to protect that particular society and community. It has given rise today to nation states where the divide between the rich and the poor is extraordinary in every nation state and is getting wider. And it's also given rise to a situation where the rich are destroying the earth. The civilizational worldview is one we all subscribe to. We are like goldfish in the bowl. We are all in it. And so it's difficult, you know, like a bird in the air, it doesn't recognize the air. We don't actually, I suppose, what's our context is probably language, actually. We take language for granted. So we're all part of this. We're all blind to other possibilities, except that there are different mindsets within that civilizational worldview. The dominant one, of course, is the Occidental worldview, Occidental mindset. That is us. It's particularly in Europe and the US, Great Britain, Australia, Canada. We have learned how to measure the external world. We do it brilliantly. We analyse and we measure. We've become very adept at that. And we understand our world through analysis. But it's not the only way. If you work in China, for example, the Sinic mindset in the civilizational worldview, still the same worldview, is one more of balance. Balance between the external and the internal worlds. Balance between, in practical terms, yes, I do want to focus on renewable energy, but I will also build a coal-fired power station. Yin and yang. Very common. That, again, is different from the Indic mindset. In India, and to some extent in Southeast Asia, the cultural mindset is one of focusing on internal transcendence, the internal state. And the dream world is everything that exists outside of that. It's the external world. So in a way, the Indic mindset is the reverse. It's the shadow of the Occidental worldview. Now, we put this down when we notice differences. We put it down to culture. It goes far deeper than culture. Culture is an aspect of it. But the mindset itself, the way we think, is actually deeply ingrained. So what we have in this civilizational worldview are different mindsets. And I've only given you 3 examples. There are other examples. Japan, if you take Japan as a nation state, actually the Japanese mindset is a kind of hybrid of Sinic, Indic, Occidental. One of the great dangers, of course, is that most people around the world now are trying to copy the Occidental mindset of the worldview. Why? Because we live at such levels of luxury compared with many people in the world that those that do not have aspire to be like us. So when we were doing this research, this was research, by the way, when we were doing this research, we could then make better sense of what we were seeing in the actual behaviours of the people we were working with, whether it be in South America, which is actually it's another one, it's an Amerindian kind of mindset where blood sacrifice, if you go back in history, is very, very important. And even today, in certain aspects of what is happening in Brazil, for example, which we are only too aware of given our recent expeditions to Brazil, there's that mindset still embedded in parts of society. I'm confusing some people. Okay, I will move on a little bit. That realization was the seed of 2 propositions. That the leadership paradigm that we commonly understand and work with and espouse, especially in organizations and governments, and expect to see in our so-called leaders, is deeply flawed and not rational. It's not rational in that it doesn't actually add up, it doesn't make sense. The idea that someone is a leader only through a charismatic stance, having a vision of what needs to be done, an ability to inspire people and engage with people, all of that is rubbish, to be honest. It's rubbish. And yet, it's commonly held that that's what leadership is all about, and probably commonly held by most of us in this room, if the truth were known, if we go deeply inside ourselves. Commonly held, of course, that is the model we should aspire to be leaders. But then you see, you cannot account for the 29-year-old woman working in Cambodia with orphans who know nothing about what's happening in the world, who is, through her work, transcending their lives, actually, I should say transforming their lives, so that they don't ask for handouts, so that they see hope in their future, so that they see new possibilities that weren't there before, in terms of how they live their lives, who they relate to, and how they can create their own kind of prosperity, wealth and well-being. You cannot account for Dr. Kisana, a Thai doctor who's been working in India for the past 30 years, who has been focused on creating a very low-cost remedy to assist HIV sufferers. You cannot account for even people whose names you might have heard of in China, where the mindset is such in Europe that there is such fear of that other, that obviously the people we hear about are not leaders, or they're leaders that we do not respect and we do not admire. So there was something wrong with everything we were seeing around us in terms of behaviour, what was happening with leadership, which was the beginning of the work on the 5 literacies. Now I should also say at this stage that this is work in progress. Okay, a book has been published, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I believe those 5 literacies are, why the 5 literacies, what those things are. But this is ongoing work, and as I pointed out just a few moments ago, it wasn't until the book had been published that I realised what we'd actually stumbled across. Fundamentally, one of the things we stumbled across was the theories relating to leadership models are wrong. There are 2 major ones. One is about 100 years old, and that is the charismatic theory. It's this notion of the white knight on the white charger charging to the rescue and solving all the problems of the world. If you think about that model, it eliminates women. So women, please leave the room because you cannot be leaders if we subscribe to that theory. The other theory, which relates to started about 50 years ago, is contingency theory. And there are whole industries grown up around this theory. And this theory is wrong, mind you. The contingency theory maintains that there is a right person for the right job at the right time. So it's a matter of searching for and finding the right person. Now, if you know the search industry, search companies, who actually look for new CEOs, so you get rid of one CEO and you pull in another CEO, all of that work is predicated on this theory, which must be correct. Wrong. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If it does work, it's completely accidental or good luck. It's a theory that is flawed. The only other theory we could find, which really did begin to make sense in terms of what we were seeing, was a relatively new theory, perhaps social scientists will correct me if there are any in this room, it may be 10 to 15 years old, I think, and that is the theory of social identity. That is the ability to identify with a group and be part of that group. And it's interesting that even in corporate life, when John Brown, bless him, before his fall from grace from BP, so I'm talking probably 10 years ago when I started working with BP, or 12 years ago, the ability of John Brown was not to come up with a vision, but to actually express the deeply held passion for the idea of going beyond oil into some new space that was held by almost 117,000 people in a company called BP. So it was not his vision. Beyond petroleum wasn't John's vision. It was his ability to express that and then closely identify with everyone in the company. Anyone from BP here? Anyone from Shell here? More likely? No. Oh, good. I can be rude about Shell. No, not good. So, if there is a theory underpinning what we're beginning to find out about leadership, global leadership, it's more likely to be the theory of social identity rather than charismatic theory or contingency theory. Going to literacies. Remember, we were working all around the world, and so what I was writing needed to make sense in different cultures, different mindsets, but within the civilizational worldview. I want to say something about the civilizational worldview in a minute. The various elements we saw seem to arise from a different state of being. If you take a John Brown, or a Richard Branson, or an Anita Roddick, or the 2 people I've already mentioned who you won't know, Dr. Chris Arnaz and Melanie Chan, who's the woman in Cambodia, or a guy called Good News Cadogan in Africa, or, you know, people I won't drop names because you won't know who they are. But if you look at all of them, understanding their behaviour will confuse you. It will not make sense. You'll see them doing things. They're called leaders, right? They do things. But actually, you don't start from there to understand how they are leaders. But we do, because we're so dominated in our thinking by psychology. In the West, I'm talking, in the Occident. We're so dominated by psychology. But in Africa, in China, in India, in Southeast Asia, in South America, that won't wash. It won't work. Okay, you can have an assessment centre, and you can bring in organisational psychologists. Doesn't mean a damn thing. You won't find leaders like that. So we realised that we had to go to this inner state of being. We had to find out what are the most deeply held beliefs in this human being, in how they believed they related to each other and to the planet, whereby they would see different possibilities, make different choices, take different decisions, and therefore exhibit behaviour that was different. So you see, to understand leadership, you don't start with looking for behaviour because it's confusing. That's the end point. You start with trying to understand the inner person. When we started doing that research, we came up with 5 interdependent, interactive domains of knowledge, which we call literacies. Why do we call them literacies? Well, does anyone here remember the first time you went to a different culture where you didn't speak the language, you couldn't read the signs, you couldn't understand why people were doing certain things, and you really felt, you know, completely alien? Have any of you felt that? Yeah? Most of us have. In that moment, we become as illiterate as a newborn baby, because we are not socialised into that culture, into that situation. So a literacy is acquiring knowledge that allows us to become literate, so that we begin to understand. We use the term literacy quite deliberately because the in vogue term at the time was 10 years ago, roughly, was competency. And I've been going into organisations and finding lists of leadership competencies. How stupid is that? I mean, it is really negligent thinking to think that leaders have competencies. Managers, yes. One of the things, of course, we've done in organisations is to blur the distinction between leadership and management, which is a real disservice to management. All the fad is around leadership and leadership development. But you don't want too many leaders. You do want very good managers. You do want entrepreneurs. And that's another thing we tend to lack. We focus on leaders. We have to have leaders everywhere. You know, leaders at all levels. Leaders here, there, and everywhere. We just want leaders. My goodness, can you imagine the kind of organisation that will be with everyone pulling in a different direction? Everyone coming up with different ways of changing. Everyone coming up with different wants and desires and needs, different expectations. So we said, okay, we need to forget competency, that's a management thing. What we're talking about here are whole domains of knowledge. And so far, and I stress this, so far, we've only come up with 5. I'm sure there are more there under the surface. And I'm sure more will develop as the world changes around us, particularly as the need to use and understand technologies, new technologies, and the kind of merging of robotics, biotechnology, and nanotechnology becomes more embedded in our daily lives. There will new domains of knowledge will be needed. But these 5 were interesting. The first was we call it networked intelligence. It's the ability to understand everything that's going on around you in real time. And it's a human attribute. I've learnt today, although I've been in Amsterdam quite a few times, but I've learnt today, and my wife actually, who's with me, learned much faster than me, that you just don't step off the curb before you make damn sure there's not a bike, not a taxi, not a truck. In Amsterdam, it's a bike coming at you full pelt with a bell ringing. I've learned that. You use all your senses, not just hearing, sight, but literally all your senses to make sure that you're intelligent enough to miss the bikes. That's called networked intelligence. And the boundaries go out. And the more responsibilities you take on as a leader, those boundaries go out even further. And so those people who we look up to as world leaders, like a Nelson Mandela, for example, as just one example, are concerned with having that kind of networked intelligence, real-time intelligence, and absorbing that all the time. It's knowledge of the whole system, not part of the system. And if you've got intelligence coming in and you're processing that all the time, and in the human body, of course, it's it's what is called an autonomic system. We don't need to concentrate on it. It happens automatically. You need to do something with it. And we noted that what we now call 5 literacies leaders didn't have vision necessarily. It was difficult to describe, but they did have foresight. They did imagine things that others of us didn't imagine could be possible. If you take a Richard Branson, for example, and look at Virgin Galactic, which is a new business, and the idea, and it hasn't actually started yet, although the first 3 years, I believe, are fully booked up now, to go into outer space on a spaceship. I think it'll cost you around $350,000 US at today's pricing. But if you want to see, you'll have to wait 3 or 4 years because, as I say, they're fully booked up. And that's vision in a sense, but it's more connected with practically what is possible and what do I want to make happen. So foresight, or strategic foresight, is how you use systemic intelligence, networked intelligence. So, okay, all of this information is coming in, and you can see it in the eyes of people who we regard as brilliant leaders. And you can see how they express where it is, where the future has to be different for them, what they're trying to create. You then need the ability to navigate from where you are today into the future. And these people seem to have it brilliantly. They seem almost instinctively to know how to navigate prevailing conditions, to reduce friction, to reduce stress, to reduce all the problems, to get to the future faster. So strategic navigation is the 3rd literacy. The 4th literacy we call deep design. It's the ability to talk or sing into being something extraordinary. It's the ability to design whole systems collaboratively. It's the ability to really talk something into existence. It's the ability to create yet to be embodied knowledge in a way that is understood and people find compelling. And the fifth literacy, which we call brand resonance, and has nothing to do with marketing brand. It's that almost emergent quality that seems to occur when everyone out there is saying of you what you yourself are saying of you. It's that alignment between of communications, if you like, that can be amplified to a great extent, can be amplified. So these were 5 literacies, and when we came to look at them in detail with different people, it seemed to make sense. It seemed to make better sense, at least, than the work of people I've mentioned already. I've been quite disparaging about them, where correlation is seen, but automatically a cause is ascribed to that correlation erroneously. Not good. So the prospect is, for me, two things. The prospect is that leadership is not as we have been taught. Leadership is not what we have been told it is. Leadership is inherent within each of us. Given certain conditions and the ability to hone and refine and tune, almost like a musical composition, ourselves into a different relationship with each other and with the planet. And the second thing that I think is important is that when we tune into that kind of resonance, that energy, sounds new age, doesn't it? Sorry, it's not supposed to. But when we are able to tune into that, effort drops away. Everything becomes easy. We can do far more than we ever thought ourselves capable of doing. You know, it just drops away, like the physical body even drops away. And you can stand outside of yourselves, watching yourselves create something which was not there before, but is now being embodied. I now believe, actually, having seen this right around the world, in people, as I said, ordinary people doing extraordinary things, that this is a vanguard, a new kind of leadership, or a group of people who see new possibilities from a new level of consciousness of who we are and why we're here. I firmly believe that now. There's one other thing I'd like to say just before we open to questions, because I've gone on too long. I said I wouldn't. And that is, one of the underlying models that we use to make sense of the 5 literacies is to do with human performance. And if you can imagine an infinity loop, I'll draw it for you. Here it is. Okay. And here is the past, here is the present, or the here and now, and here is the possible. And actually, brain chemistry will tell you that each of us, the human mind goes through that process of looping between past, present, and possible every millisecond. But usually we don't make the past explicit unless we're reading history or we're actually extracting memories and experiences. And normally we don't make the future or the possible explicit unless we're working on scenarios or stories or narratives that give, or memories from the future that actually focus attention on the future. Mostly we focus on the here and now, and we blot out or ignore the past and the possible. We're focusing our attention on the here and now, and we use what psychologists call attention density to make sure that this is what we're doing. Now, 5 literacies leaders are able to transcend that. And this is why we possibly experience that leadership as charismatic. It's possibly why we experience that leadership as different or something to aspire to. It's because it's so palpable that they are bringing the past and the possible into the current here and now, into an expanded now, and moving forward with from an internal state of knowing, every moment being the best they can possibly be in that moment. And if you look at human performance, if you look at a really fantastic performing athlete, if you go to the Concertgebouw and watch a concert violinist in performance, in flow, in the zone, if you watch an amazing orator like Sir Ken Robinson, for example, who was in Amsterdam last year at Amsterdam, was speaking here. But you can see him on TED. If you go to the TED and look up Sir Ken Robinson, you'll see what I mean. If you look at human performance, at its very best, what it actually is a rehearsal of past and memories of past drawn into the present, an understanding of what needs to be achieved and how that can be achieved, therefore creating an expanded now of potential which elevates and amplifies and accelerates everything you are. And that is what I see in the 5 literacies, in 5 literacies leaders. That's what I've been trying desperately and very badly to explain in the book. I haven't articulated it well. I haven't even expressed it well here. But, you know, if I can say it in 2 minutes, in a way, writing a book of something like, I don't know how many words, but it's probably 200,000 words, is a nonsense. But I hope I've got across to you the essence, at least, of what we're beginning to see, and I firmly believe is embedded in each and every one of us. I just want to end, sorry, on one last thought, and that is, most of the issues and problems facing humanity are such that that level of consciousness is badly needed. If you look at the ways we are trying to solve our problems at the moment, of course that cannot work. You look at Copenhagen. There were 21,000 negotiators at Copenhagen trying to come to some kind of consensus on universal approaches to climate change. And they couldn't even come up with putting a price on carbon. Something simple. Of course not. Because the way we construct, design our institutions are designed to maintain the status quo. They are designed quite intentionally to keep the rich rich and the poor poor. And they are designed to ensure that competition prevails. Has anyone here heard of Peter Kropotkin? Only Peter? Peter Kropotkin? You heard of Jesus Christ? Charles Darwin, perhaps. Charles Darwin was very fortunate because he was an amateur naturalist, biologist, went to explore the warm waters of the South Pacific, and he saw competition within and between species, and he told Thomas Huxley, oh, that was a good thing to do. That was a fantastic thing to do, because Thomas Huxley travelled and he blabbed. I mean, he couldn't stop talking. He was telling everyone about competitive nature of human beings, because it exists right across. Peter Kropotkin didn't have a Thomas Huxley. He was an anarchist. He was a Russian prince in exile. No one listened to him. But like Darwin, he'd been an amateur naturalist, and he went to Siberia. Now, most of you know that Siberia is different from the South Pacific in several ways. There's one fundamental way, one fundamental difference. You know what it is?
The heat.
Pardon?
The heat.
The heat or the lack of it. The heat there, the lack of it there. Absolutely. Siberia is cold. And guess what he saw? Within and between species, everywhere he looked, he saw cooperation. And biologists know these days, of course, if you ask biologists these days about the balance needed, Sinic or Chinese mindset, yin-yang, between competition and cooperation, that of course we need both. In the human family, all of our language, even Dutch, is designed to reach consensus and agreement at a basic level, fundamental level. We are intensely collaborative, cooperative beings, and yet we're being told that we're essentially competitive, and most of our institutions are designed that way. Prisons, schools, hospitals, I can go on, governments certainly, but they've been designed to enshrine competition. Why, in Australia, they even have a highly defined definition of competition policy to prevent things happening. I'm going to stop there because you must have some questions. And I never usually sit on chairs like this because I'm shorter than the average Dutch man. And it looks funny when my legs dangle. I'm going to sit here. No, that's right. Any questions?
Thanks, Richard. I'm curious about your networked intelligence literacy. And what I heard you say was it's this ability to understand everything around you all the time. And what I'd like to hear you reflect on is what percentage of that knowing did you encounter as being an intuitive access versus kind of a conceptual, analytical access?
Yeah, good question. I wouldn't actually want to put a figure on it, a percentage. But quite a lot of the time, given different situations, it seems to be very instinctive. I mean, we know from science, from scientific research, we know that most of the decisions we make are based on partial information. We may think we've got all the information in the world in order to make a decision, but usually we don't. There are always variables. But I think a lot of the time with 5 Literacies leaders is a very strong instinct for understanding what is going on. You know, there's a biologist by the name of Rupert Sheldrake who works on morphic fields, morphic resonance. And so, you know, you have over there in Beijing, you have a group of 5 rats in a cage who learn a new trick. And halfway around the world, another group of 5 caged rats suddenly, for no apparent reason, learn how to do that trick much faster. Same kind of thing. I think we're developing a collective instinct around the world, and it's manifesting in different ways, but I think it's manifesting, one of the ways it's manifesting is in the reaction communities like ours now, grassroots communities, are reacting to issues like climate change. The laggards are the politicians and the experts. There's an instinct in society that we need to do something about it. So I think instinct is very, very important, and I see it, all I can say is I see it more and more. Where rationality has existed, or we've seen rationality existing before, instinct or some kind of internal knowing is more and more important.
Thanks, Richard. My question is, I have personally a lot of resonance with what I've heard you say about the 5 literacies, and I haven't read your book yet.
You haven't?
Yet. My question is, I mean, as I read a lot of literature around business or personal transformation or whatever field we're talking about, there's a lot of, I guess, models or propositions about certain literacies or capacities or ways of doing things differently, which I find a lot of resonance with a lot of them. And what I don't find in many of the books is how we facilitate the development to allow those to grow in people.
Yeah.
It often is, I find, classified as this is the better way of doing things, and this is the old way of doing things, which we shouldn't do anymore. None of them tell us what's the manual about how we do that.
No, that's right.
You could speak to that in your way.
It's something we're beginning to grapple with. And it's an extremely difficult question because, you know, the whole issue of development, as it's been formalized, I think, actually caps what we're capable of being. If we can be different, then we can think differently and do differently. And so where I look mostly is the opposite or the shadow side for what has been formalized in the expectation that that is the best way. I'll give you an example, practical example. I'm working with a large international bank, and they have spent literally millions, tens of millions of dollars on developing the top 200 leaders in this bank. And it's benefited the top 200 leaders in that bank, and no more. And so my proposition has been to amplify the value, the investment actually, the financial investment that they've made in ways that allow that new knowledge that resides in some heads, 200 heads, to actually impact everyone in the bank, which we're talking about, I think it's about 45,000 people. And so what we're doing at the moment is trying to find ways where we can actually collaborate, co-design, and work on the job in ways that don't need gurus, that don't need expert knowledge, that actually allow for experiment and failure and learning, but in ways that will be generative, that it constantly expands. And so we've started with the 200, and we've taken away all the gurus and the workshops and the development programs and all of that crap to try and allow it to burgeon within the organisation. Now, it's early days, and I haven't described that well, but we'll see. But it's a real problem. Sorry. I think there are three. You don't leave management out. I think there are three categories of people you need in an enterprise. You need leaders. You do need leaders to change things, because you can constantly, nowadays, the environment is changing so rapidly that in order to stay competitive, in order to stay ahead, you need to be changing stuff. And you need to come up with new products, new ideas, new inventions. Bearing in mind that most innovation occurs within the networks. Innovation doesn't occur within a small group. Innovation occurs now in collaborative spaces. You need managers, because once you commit to making something and then selling it to somebody else, you need for processes to be efficient as possible. You need to make sure that quality is high. You make sure that all the things that you need to do as part of an enterprise are done well. Unfortunately, with the fad of leadership being emphasised so much, the discipline of management has been forgotten very often. And I want to re-emphasise that. And entrepreneurship is absolutely vital in terms of new ideas. Not just change, new ideas. And I'm not talking necessarily about innovation, but entire reinvention of business models, the invention of new markets, the invention of new possibilities. And entrepreneurial energy actually does that. So you need those three factors live and working together in any enterprise. So one of the people I most admire in corporate life is Jeff Immelt. When Jeff, at GE, when Jeff took over from Jack Welch, who had been labelled the world's most successful CEO, he asked the question, how on earth do I step into his shoes? And one of the things he realised was that he actually could liberate the entrepreneurial reignite the entrepreneurial spirit within GE in ways which Welch had not found. And that was the way he took, and I think GE's a lot better for it because of that. So, some ideas? Yes, sorry, you
Oh, I was still with the question you had, and I was wondering if you make also a connection with outer leadership and internal leadership, the development of also how to deal with your own personal system in order to deal with the outer systems.
Yes.
As maybe asking for that question.
Okay. everywhere I look with the people we've been working with, the two are not separate. And you cannot change anything externally unless you start from within. I think it's something that we've missed totally. But it's back to that Occidental, that Western view of things. Tangibility, things that we can see happening, events. And we've not integrated that Indic mindset of working on ourselves.
But it's happening though now.
It's now happening, yes, it's happening a lot. But I wouldn't regard it as separate. But one of the things I said about Five Literacies leaders was that it's an integral praxis. Integral in this, not a Ken Wilber integral necessarily, but that integral nature of both individually and collectively understanding what is inside and then relating that constantly backwards and forwards to what is external and improving both, working on both. You're frowning, you've been frowning right the way through. Is this your happy face?
Mine is yeah, your introduction resonated with me as well as your whole talk. Yeah, I really see and feel it. The question I have is what is your proposition in sharing this? Let me phrase that maybe a bit differently. As I am going through life and I observe traditional definitions of leadership, and I read those books that we don't like and doesn't quite fit. But what I do see is the system conditions of civilization seem to promote, and the people, some people who exhibit the charismatic leadership seem to succeed. You know, they're driving the Ferrari, I'm not. By those measures of success, people seem to also want to emulate that more maybe traditional or flawed leadership design. And so my question is the system condition changing, which has been creating space for what you have been able to capture in words? Or are we changing and therefore forcing the system conditions to change?
Yeah, I think both. I understand the question. It's a very good question. I think both are happening. I think there is a new level of consciousness amongst us around the world, and collectively that's generating a field effect, an energy that is palpable now. At the same time, I think individuals are contributing in ways that they've never contributed before, but I think also we're in transition from one kind of world to another, in which we've come up abruptly, faster than we ever thought, to the limits imposed upon us by nature and physics. And now we're having to deal with that, so we're going to have to, whether we like it or not, we're beginning to reinterpret value. What is value to us? What is wealth? What is well-being? And it's not a loss of anything. It's not doing without the Ferrari. It's actually moving beyond Ferrari to something else. And for all of us, that's different. But so I believe it's happening on different levels. A lot of people don't understand that again, it's the Western paradigm. We focus on the market economy. And a lot of people believe that's all there is. But in other parts of the world, there are different economies. There are different economic modes. So the market mode is just one mode. It's not everything. There's the redistributive mode, which you get in barter systems, for example. Very common in some parts of the world. There are reciprocal modes which are being developed now, and there are new modes even being talked about today in the corridors of the UN to balance individual or, if you like, corporate wealth on the one hand with the wealth of the commons, our wealth that we all share, on the other. And these are all different economic modes. So we need economies or economic modes, and we also need new governance models. So all of those interlink. Energy, environment, economy, and governance. Those four are the life-critical hub systems we need to redesign. Now the problem there, of course, is that the people we ascribe the authority, we give the authority to do the redesigns, don't want to do the redesigns because they're protecting the status quo. Wherever you look, in every culture, simply because, I'll come back to my initial proposition, this civilizational worldview is the one that the rich are protecting. And by the rich, I'm talking about us as well. Pogo said, years ago in a strip comic in America, the character Pogo says, "We have found the enemy. It's us." And of course, what we're condemning, because when I was born, about 2 billion people on the planet. Now, about 7 billion people on the planet. If we actually don't redesign those life-critical hub systems and do it intentionally so that our evolution of our species becomes intentional, then we are condemning around 4.5 to 5 billion people to a certain death. And as one of our most eminent scientists who came up with the Gaian theory of the planet being a living thing, a living organism, James Lovelock, who's getting on now, he's in his 90s, isn't he? He's getting on now, but his latest book is terrifying. He maintains that by the end of the next century, there will be about 1 million people on the planet. And they will be the rich. Unless we actually do something about it and say our intentionality is different. Going forward, we're going to create a different kind of world.
You just said intentionality, and I was about to ask anyway. The thread I hear running through much of what you said and what others have asked you, it reminds me of Rollo May's Love and Will. And for me, that is contained within the word intention as well. I find it synonymous. So I'm wondering what patterns you encountered in your exploration of leaders around the scope of intention with regard to what is loved and what is willed for.
Yes. I think actually you've put your finger on the main thing that caused us to sit up and say, hang on, this is different. Because even in corporate life, the people we were working with weren't just interested in the short-term return to shareholders, that kind of system. They were seemingly moving into a different kind of understanding or space, if you like, about the whole human family. So their scope kind of expanded like this. That's how they explain it. They felt the language most commonly used is empowered, but what they meant by that was not what we usually understand by that. They meant a sense of self that was metamorphosing into something entirely different, like the chrysalis suddenly through. Peter will talk about the imaginal cells within the chrysalis, which basically a chrysalis turns to goo. It doesn't turn into a moth, it turns into goo. And then out of nowhere, these new kinds of cells start appearing out of nowhere. And the goo eats them up as fast as it can, because they're different. But eventually there are so many of them that the imaginal cells actually take over, and they then start a critical evolutionary moment happens where they actually start turning into parts of the moth or the butterfly. And eventually you get a butterfly. It's something very difficult to explain, but in a way I think that's what's happening in society today. I think the goo is that formal level of understanding at a level which was competitive and not wanted and not desired, not willed for, if you like. And I believe the imaginal cells that we're beginning to see patchily today, but not in individuals, but more now in clusters and communities, are the imaginal cells that will take us at a new level of consciousness into a more beneficial, less exploitative world society, world system.
We say compassionate.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And more loving. This is a thing, I was only working with a few guys the other day in London, and mostly from corporates, and we were skirting around that word. They used every word in the dictionary but love. And I pointed it out, and there was a kind of embarrassed silence. But we're getting there. We're getting there. You've got to say it. You've got to shout it.